I never thought my own birthday would turn into a crime scene where I was the prisoner. My stepbrother Jack locked me inside my own apartment, took the key, and walked away with a smile, thinking his evil plan was flawless. He intended to frame me as mentally unstable to steal the only thing my mother left me. The storm outside was so loud that it drowned out my screams, and for a moment I thought it was over. But Jack made one fatal mistake. He forgot about the small red light blinking in the window across the street. He didn't know that my neighbor's security camera was recording every single second of his betrayal. This is the story of how my darkest night turned into his worst nightmare. Before we continue with this story of betrayal and justice, please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. My name is Diana Cooper. I live in Brooklyn, New York. Most people know me as a quiet, hard-working woman who keeps to herself. But the Diana you are about to hear about had to change. She had to become a fighter. It all started on my 28th birthday. Since my mother passed away, birthdays had always been a little bittersweet for me. That evening, the sky was gray and heavy, almost as if the weather knew something bad was about to happen. All I wanted to do was go back to the small brick-walled apartment my mother had left me, cut a small cake, and rest. That apartment wasn't just four walls. It was my sanctuary. It was the only thing my stepbrother Jack had been trying to get his hands on for years. Jack was my mother's son from her second marriage. He had always been jealous of me. He envied my grades, my friends, and my mother's love. But mostly, he envied this house. When I arrived home that evening, the hallway was unusually quiet. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and put my bag down. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door, and there stood Jack. He was soaking wet from the rain, but he had a strange, disturbing smile on his face. "Surprise," he said. His voice tried to sound cheerful, but his eyes were cold as ice. "You didn't think you would spend your birthday alone, did you, dear sister?" I felt a knot form in my stomach. I told him I was tired and asked him to leave. But he didn't listen. He gently pushed me by the shoulder, forcing me back into the apartment. It was a light push, but his intention felt heavy. "I have a gift for you, Diana," he said, his voice suddenly turning serious. He reached into his pocket. I expected a gift box, but what he pulled out was not a present. It was my spare house key. How did he get that? When did he steal it? Before I could process what was happening, Jack suddenly jumped back into the hallway. I was inside, and he was outside. The distance between us was only one step, but that step was about to become an impossible gap. I shouted, asking him what he was doing, and lunged for the door. He slammed it shut. The sound echoed through the hallway. Then came the terrifying metallic sound. Click. The lock had turned. I grabbed the handle. It wouldn't budge. I started pounding on the door. "Jack, this isn't funny. Open the door." His voice came through the wood, muffled but terrifyingly clear. He said, "I'm sorry, Diana, but I'm doing this for your own good. I told everyone about how unstable you've become lately, how you're seeing hallucinations and trying to hurt yourself. Tonight, it will look like you had a mental breakdown. When they come for you in the morning, you'll be taken straight to a clinic. And as your legal guardian, I will take care of the house." I froze. I turned around to run to the table where my phone should have been. It wasn't there. I checked my bag. It was gone. Jack laughed from the other side of the door. "Are you looking for this?" I looked through the peephole and saw my phone in his hand. He had swiped it when he pushed me inside. I begged him to stop, tears streaming down my face. "Happy birthday, sister." "Enjoy it," he said, and then I heard his footsteps fading away down the stairs. I was alone. I was locked in. And outside, the thunder was roaring loud enough to swallow my screams. I ran to the window and tried to open it, but the old frames were jammed and only opened a few inches. I screamed for help into the rainy street, but the street was empty. No one could hear me. I sank to the floor in despair. Jack had won. They were going to declare me insane. He was going to take my home, my life, and my dignity. But in that moment of hopelessness, my eyes caught something through the window. Across the street, on the second floor of the opposite building, was Mrs. Hall's apartment. There, shining through the rain, was a tiny blinking red light. It was Mrs. Hall's new security camera, and it was pointed directly at my front door. Jack's plan was perfect except for one thing. That camera must have recorded everything. It saw him push me in, lock the door, steal my phone, and walk away with the key. I stood up and wiped my tears. I was not going to be a victim tonight. That camera was my ticket to freedom, but first I had to find a way out of this apartment. And then I was going to teach Jack a lesson he would never forget. The storm outside was getting worse, and the rain was hammering against the windows like 1,000 angry fists trying to break through the glass. But inside my mind, there was a different kind of storm brewing because I knew that if I didn't act fast, then Jack's twisted plan would work, and I would lose everything my mother had worked so hard to leave me. I paced back and forth across the living room trying to think clearly, even though my heart was racing and my hands were trembling because the reality of what was happening was finally sinking in, and it felt like the walls were closing in on me with every passing second. Jack had been planning this for weeks, maybe even months, and I had been too blind to see the signs. Because I always tried to see the good in people, even in someone like him, who had shown me nothing but resentment and jealousy since the day our parents got married. I remembered how he used to stare at this apartment whenever he visited, and how he would make comments about how it was too big for just one person, and how it would be better if the family could share it. But I never thought he would go this far because locking your own sister inside her home on her birthday and trying to have her declared mentally incompetent was beyond cruel. It was evil. I walked over to the window again and looked across the street at Mrs. Hall's apartment, and that little red blinking light gave me hope, because it was the only evidence that could prove my innocence and expose Jack's lies. But the problem was that I was trapped inside this apartment with no phone, no way to contact anyone, and no way to get to that camera footage before Jack could spin his story to the police and my family. I started checking every possible way out of the apartment, and I tried the front door again, even though I knew it was locked from the outside with the deadbolt that required a key, and there was no way to unlock it from the inside without that key. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a butter knife, thinking maybe I could somehow pick the lock or force it open, but when I tried to slide the knife into the door frame, it was useless because the door was solid and the lock was modern and professionally installed, just like my mother had wanted when she renovated the apartment 2 years before she passed away. I moved to the windows next and tried every single one in the apartment, starting with the living room, then the bedroom, and finally the kitchen. But they were all the same old wooden frames that had been painted over so many times that they were practically sealed shut, and the ones that did open only opened about 3 or 4 inches, which was enough to let in some air, but definitely not enough for me to squeeze through or even to shout loud enough for anyone to hear me over the sound of the thunder and rain. I even considered breaking the glass, but then I realized that would play right into Jack's hands because if the police showed up and found me surrounded by broken glass and cuts on my hands, it would only support his story that I was having a violent mental breakdown, and that would be exactly what he needed to have me committed. I felt the frustration building inside me like a pressure cooker ready to explode, and I wanted to scream and throw things and break everything in sight, but I forced myself to stay calm, because I knew that losing control would mean losing everything. Then I remembered something that made my blood run cold and my stomach drop because I realized that Jack hadn't just planned to lock me in for the night, he had also made sure that nobody would come looking for me until it was too late. Earlier that day, I had received birthday calls from my aunt and a few friends, and I had told them all that I was planning to have a quiet night at home by myself because I wasn't in the mood for a big celebration. And I had even declined an invitation to dinner from my coworker Sarah because I just wanted to be alone with my thoughts and memories of my mother. Jack must have known about this because he had probably been listening to my conversations or checking my messages somehow, and he had timed his attack perfectly so that nobody would expect to hear from me until at least the next morning, or maybe even later. I also remembered that I had texted my aunt earlier saying that I was going to turn off my phone for the night because I wanted some peace and quiet, and that text had been sent from my phone, which Jack now had in his possession, which meant he could use it to send more messages pretending to be me, and making it seem like everything was fine. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how carefully Jack had orchestrated every single detail of this nightmare and how he had been studying my habits and routines for months, just waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. And tonight, on my birthday, when I was at my most vulnerable and isolated, he had finally made his move. I sat down on the couch and tried to think logically about what would happen next because I needed to understand Jack's full plan if I was going to have any chance of stopping it. He would probably wait until morning and then he would call my aunt, or maybe even the police, and tell them that he was worried about me because I hadn't been answering my phone and I had been acting strangely lately. He would mention that I had been talking about seeing things that weren't there, or hearing voices. Or maybe he would say that I had been making concerning statements about hurting myself, and he would play the role of the concerned brother who just wanted to help his troubled sister. When they arrived at the apartment, they would find me locked inside, looking disheveled and panicked after spending the whole night trapped and desperate, and my behavior would seem erratic and unstable, especially if I started raving about how Jack had locked me in and stolen my phone, because without any proof, it would just sound like paranoid delusions. Jack would shake his head sadly and show them text messages he had fabricated using my phone. And maybe he had even created fake journal entries or voice recordings that made it seem like I was losing my grip on reality. And with enough false evidence and his convincing performance as the worried stepbrother, the authorities would have no choice but to take me in for psychiatric evaluation. Once I was in the system, Jack would use his power of attorney, or whatever legal documents he had forged, to take control of my assets, including this apartment, and by the time I was released from the psychiatric facility, if I was ever released, my life would be completely destroyed, and Jack would be living in my home, probably already having changed the locks and sold off my mother's belongings. The thought of Jack touching my mother's things made me feel physically sick, because this apartment wasn't just a piece of property, it was filled with memories and mementos that could never be replaced. My mother's favorite armchair was still in the corner by the window where she used to sit and read every Sunday morning, and her collection of vintage teacups was displayed in the cabinet that her own mother had given her, and there were photographs on every wall showing our family history going back 3 generations. Jack didn't care about any of that because all he saw was dollar signs and square footage, and the chance to finally have something that he felt he deserved even though he had done nothing to earn it except be born to a man who married my mother. I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and fierce, and it burned away some of the fear and helplessness because I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my freedom, I was fighting for my mother's legacy and for the truth, and I wasn't going to let Jack win no matter what it took. I stood up and walked back to the window and stared at that little red light across the street, and I made a promise to myself and to my mother's memory that I would find a way to get to that camera footage and expose Jack for the manipulative criminal that he really was. I spent the next hour searching every inch of the apartment looking for anything that could help me either escape or communicate with the outside world, because I refused to just sit there and wait for Jack's plan to unfold. I went through all the drawers in the kitchen and found old batteries and rubber bands and expired coupons, but nothing useful, and then I checked the bedroom closet where I found boxes of old clothes and shoes and some of my mother's things that I hadn't been able to bring myself to sort through yet. I was about to give up on the closet when my hand brushed against something hard and rectangular at the back of the top shelf, and when I pulled it down, I realized it was an old laptop that I had completely forgotten about because it had belonged to my mother, and I hadn't turned it on since she died. My hands were shaking as I opened it and pressed the power button because I knew it was a long shot, but if the battery still had any charge and if it could connect to the internet, then I might be able to send an email or a message to someone for help. The screen flickered to life and I nearly cried with relief when I saw the battery indicator showing 12% remaining, which wasn't much, but it might be enough. I waited for what felt like an eternity while the old machine booted up, and when it finally reached the login screen, I typed in my mother's password, which I remembered because she had always used the same one, which was my birthday, combined with her favorite flower. The desktop appeared and I immediately clicked on the browser icon, but my heart sank when I saw the error message. That said, there was no internet connection because, of course, Jack had thought of everything, and he must have turned off the Wi-Fi router before he left, or maybe he had changed the password so I couldn't access it. I wanted to throw the laptop across the room in frustration, but instead I took a deep breath and tried to think of other options because there had to be something I could do with this device even without internet. I opened the File Explorer and started looking through my mother's old documents and photos, hoping that maybe I would find something that could help me understand what to do next, or at least give me some comfort during this horrible night. I found folders full of family pictures and recipes she had collected and letters she had written but never sent, and as I scrolled through them, I felt tears streaming down my face because seeing her handwriting and her smile in those photos made me miss her so much that it physically hurt. Then I noticed a folder labeled Legal Documents, and something made me click on it, even though I wasn't sure what I was looking for, and inside I found copies of her will, and the deed to the apartment, and various insurance policies and tax forms. I was about to close the folder when I saw another file at the bottom called Jack Important, and my curiosity got the better of me, so I opened it, and what I saw inside made my blood run cold because it was a letter that my mother had written just a few weeks before she died, and it was addressed to me. The letter started with, "My dearest Diana, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I need you to know some things about Jack that I should have told you years ago, but I was too afraid and too ashamed." I read on with my heart pounding because my mother explained that she had discovered that Jack had been stealing money from her bank account for over 2 years, and that he had forged her signature on several documents, including a loan application that had been denied and a change of beneficiary form for one of her life insurance policies. She wrote that she had confronted him about it, and he had denied everything and made her feel like she was crazy and confused because of her illness, and she had started to doubt her own memory and perception, which was exactly what he was trying to do to me right now. My mother had written that she was planning to cut Jack out of her will completely, and that she had made an appointment with her lawyer to update all her legal documents, but then she had gotten worse very quickly, and she never made it to that appointment. The letter ended with a warning that said, "Diana, please be careful of Jack because he is not who he pretends to be, and I am worried that once I am gone, he will try to take everything from you, so please protect yourself and protect our home, and remember that you are stronger than you think, and you have every right to stand up for what is yours." I read the letter 3 times because I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I felt a mixture of emotions crashing over me like waves because I was sad that my mother had carried this burden alone, and angry that Jack had been manipulating her even when she was dying, and grateful that she had left me this warning even though I hadn't found it until now. This letter was proof that Jack had a history of fraud and deception, and it showed that he had been planning to steal from our family for years. But the problem was that this letter was just a digital file on an old laptop with no internet connection and no way for me to send it to anyone or back it up or print it out as evidence. I looked around the apartment desperately trying to figure out what to do with this information because I knew that if I didn't find a way to preserve it, then Jack could destroy the laptop or delete the files or claim that I had fabricated the whole thing. Then I remembered that my mother had an old printer in her bedroom that she used to use for printing recipes and crossword puzzles, and I ran to check if it was still there and if it had any ink or paper left. The printer was sitting on a small desk in the corner of the bedroom covered in a thin layer of dust, and when I pressed the power button, I was shocked to hear it whir to life because I hadn't expected it to still work after all this time. I checked the paper tray and found about 20 sheets of plain white paper, which was more than enough, and I said a silent thank you to my mother for always keeping her supplies well stocked. I connected the laptop to the printer using an old USB cable that was tangled up in the desk drawer, and I hit print on the letter and held my breath while the machine made its grinding mechanical sounds, and then slowly, very slowly, the first page began to emerge. I printed 3 copies of the letter just to be safe, and then I printed copies of all the other documents in that folder, including bank statements that showed the unauthorized withdrawals and copies of the forged signatures, and anything else that could prove Jack's history of financial crimes. By the time I was finished, the laptop battery was down to 3%, and the printer was wheezing like it might give up at any moment. But I had a stack of papers in my hands that represented the truth about Jack and about what he had done to my mother and what he was trying to do to me. I felt a surge of determination because I finally had ammunition to fight back against Jack's lies, but I still had the problem of being locked inside this apartment with no way to contact anyone or show these documents to the authorities. I looked at the clock on the wall and saw that it was almost midnight, which meant I had been trapped for nearly 3 hours, and the storm outside showed no signs of letting up. I walked back to the living room window and looked across the street at Mrs. Hall's apartment, and I could still see that red light blinking faithfully like a beacon of hope in the darkness. Mrs. Hall was an elderly woman who lived alone, and she had always been kind to me, and she used to bring my mother homemade soup when she was sick, and she had cried at my mother's funeral like she had lost her own daughter. I knew that Mrs. Hall usually went to bed early around 9 or 10 o'clock, so she was probably sleeping right now, and she had no idea that I was trapped across the street, desperately needing her help. I wondered if there was any way I could get her attention, or send her some kind of signal that would make her look at her camera footage and see what Jack had done. But I didn't know how to do that from inside a locked apartment with jammed windows. I tried waving my arms in front of the window and turning the lights on and off, but I realized that even if Mrs. Hall happened to wake up and look outside, she would probably just think I was having a party or watching TV, and she wouldn't know that anything was wrong. I needed something more dramatic, something that would definitely make her notice and make her concerned enough to check her security footage or call for help. Then an idea came to me that was risky and possibly dangerous, but I was running out of options, and I was willing to try anything at this point. I went to the kitchen and found a flashlight in the utility drawer, and I also grabbed a large piece of white cardboard from the recycling bin and a thick black marker. I brought everything back to the window and I started writing in big, bold letters on the cardboard, making sure each letter was large enough to be seen from across the street, even in the dark and the rain. I wrote, "Help" and "Trapped" and "Call police." And then I added, "Camera saw everything," because I wanted Mrs. Hall to know that whatever she had recorded was important evidence. When I was finished, I held the cardboard up against the window and shined the flashlight on it, hoping that the beam would catch someone's attention, even if it wasn't Mrs. Hall herself. Then maybe someone else walking by or looking out their window would see it and wonder what was going on. I stood at the window for what felt like hours, holding up that sign and shining the flashlight on it until my arms ached and my shoulders burned with pain. But the street below remained empty and dark, except for the occasional car that drove past without slowing down, and the rain continued to fall in sheets that blurred everything beyond the glass. I was starting to lose hope, and my mind was beginning to spiral into dark thoughts about what would happen when morning came, and Jack showed up with the police and some fake psychiatrist who would declare me unfit, and I imagined being dragged out of my own home in restraints while Jack stood there with that smug smile on his face, pretending to be sad about his poor delusional sister. I couldn't let that happen, and I wouldn't let that happen, so I forced myself to keep thinking and keep looking for solutions, even though exhaustion was starting to creep into my bones and make my thoughts fuzzy and slow. I put down the sign and the flashlight, and I sat on the couch with the stack of printed documents in my lap, and I tried to come up with a plan for how I could use this evidence, even if I couldn't get it to anyone before Jack's plan went into motion tomorrow morning. Then I heard something that made me freeze in place, and my heart started racing because it was the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment door. And they were slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet, but the old wooden floors creaked with every step. I held my breath and listened carefully, wondering if Jack had come back to check on me, or maybe to do something worse, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me because I was completely vulnerable and trapped with no way to defend myself if he decided to come inside. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and I could see a shadow moving in the gap of light under the door. And then I heard a soft knocking sound that was almost gentle, like whoever was out there didn't want to disturb the neighbors. I stayed perfectly still and didn't make a sound because I wasn't sure if it was safe to respond, and I didn't know who was on the other side of that door or what they wanted. The knocking came again, slightly louder this time, and then I heard a voice that was quiet and shaky and unmistakably female, and she said, "Diana? Diana, are you in there, dear? It's Mrs. Hall from across the street." I nearly collapsed with relief because Mrs. Hall had seen my sign and she had come to help me, and I rushed to the door and pressed my face against it and said, Mrs. Hall, yes, I'm here. I'm locked in. My stepbrother trapped me inside and took my phone. Please, you have to help me call the police. There was a moment of silence, and then I heard Mrs. Hall's voice again, but this time it sounded confused and concerned, and she said, "Oh my goodness, Diana, what do you mean he locked you in?" "I was just coming home from my sister's house, and I saw your light flashing strangely through the window, and I thought something might be wrong, so I came over to check on you." I explained everything as quickly as I could, talking fast, because I was afraid that Jack might come back at any moment and catch Mrs. Hall in the hallway, and I told her about how he had pushed me inside and locked the door and stolen my phone, and how he was planning to have me declared mentally unstable so he could take my apartment. I could hear Mrs. Hall gasping on the other side of the door, and she kept saying, "Oh dear, oh my goodness, that's terrible." And then she said, "Diana, I'm going to call the police right now. Don't you worry, dear. They'll get you out of there." I felt a wave of hope wash over me because finally someone knew what was happening and someone was going to help me. But then I remembered the most important part, and I said, "Mrs. Hall, wait before you call the police. I need you to do something else first because this is really important." I explained to her about the security camera that I had seen in her window and how I believed it must have recorded Jack locking me inside the apartment, and I asked her if she could check the footage and save it before calling the police, because that video was the only proof I had that Jack had actually committed a crime, and without it, he could just claim that I had locked myself inside during a mental breakdown. Mrs. Hall was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Oh yes, dear, I do have that new camera that my grandson installed for me last month, but I'm not very good with technology, and I'm not sure how to check the recordings or save them." My heart sank because I realized that even though the evidence existed, Mrs. Hall might not be able to access it in time, and I tried to stay calm, and I said, "Mrs. Hall, this is really important. Can you please go back to your apartment right now and call your grandson and ask him to help you save the footage from tonight, especially between 7 and 8 o'clock when Jack was at my door?" Mrs. Hall promised that she would do exactly that, and she said she was going to hurry back to her apartment and call her grandson first and then call the police and tell them everything. I thanked her over and over again, and I told her to be careful and to make sure Jack didn't see her, because I didn't want him to know that someone had discovered his crime. I heard her footsteps moving away down the hallway, and then everything was quiet again except for the sound of the rain, and I leaned against the door and slid down to the floor because my legs were shaking so badly that they couldn't hold me up anymore. I clutched the stack of documents to my chest and I whispered a prayer of gratitude because after hours of feeling helpless and trapped, I finally had a real chance of getting out of this nightmare and proving that Jack was the criminal, not me. About 30 minutes later, I heard sirens in the distance, and they were getting louder and closer, and I jumped to my feet and ran to the window and looked down at the street, and I saw red and blue lights flashing through the rain as 2 police cars pulled up in front of my building. I felt tears of relief streaming down my face because help had finally arrived, and this nightmare was finally going to end, and I started pounding on the window and waving my arms, trying to get the officers' attention as they got out of their cars and looked up at the building. Within minutes, I heard heavy footsteps running up the stairs, and then there was a loud, authoritative knock on my door, and a man's voice said, "NYPD, open up, this is the police." I shouted back that I was locked inside and that I couldn't open the door from my side, and the officer said, "Okay, ma'am, step back from the door, we're going to force it open." I moved away, and then I heard a tremendous crash as the officers broke through the lock and the door flew open, and suddenly there were 2 police officers standing in my doorway, and one of them was a woman with kind eyes named Officer Martinez, and she said, "Are you Diana Cooper?" I nodded and started crying, and she came over and put a hand on my shoulder and said, "It's okay, you're safe now. Can you tell us what happened here tonight?" I told them everything, and Officer Martinez took notes and asked questions about what time it happened and whether Jack had hurt me physically and where Jack might be now, and I answered everything as clearly as I could. Then she said, "Ma'am, we spoke with your neighbor, Mrs. Hall, and she told us that she has security camera footage that might have captured what happened. Is that correct?" I nodded eagerly and handed them the stack of documents I had printed and said, "I also have evidence that Jack has been committing fraud against my family for years, and I found a letter that my mother wrote before she died warning me about him." Officer Martinez started reading through the papers, and her expression became more serious with each page, and she said, "This is very important information, and we're going to need to take these as evidence, and we've already put out a bulletin for Jack's arrest." A young officer came into my apartment carrying a laptop, and Mrs. Hall followed behind him, and she rushed over and gave me a big hug and said, "Oh, Diana, I'm so sorry this happened to you. I'm just glad I happened to come home when I did and saw your signal." The officer set up the laptop on my coffee table and pulled up the video file, and we all gathered around to watch. The footage was surprisingly clear despite the rain because Mrs. Hall's grandson had installed a high-quality camera with night vision, and the timestamp read 7:23 p.m., which was right when Jack had arrived. We watched as I appeared on screen, walking to my door and going inside, and then Jack appeared from the stairwell and he stood outside looking around to make sure nobody was watching before he rang the doorbell. The video showed me opening the door, and you could hear Jack saying something about a surprise, and then you could see him push me backwards into the apartment, and his body language was aggressive and deliberate. The camera captured Jack pulling the key out of his pocket and holding it up like a trophy, and then he stepped back and slammed the door shut, and you could see his hand turning the lock and testing the handle to make sure it was secure. Then, the most damning part showed Jack pulling my phone out of his other pocket and looking at it with a satisfied smile before he slipped it into his jacket and walked away down the hallway without looking back. Officer Martinez said, "This is one of the clearest cases of unlawful imprisonment I've ever seen, and combined with the documents you gave us about his previous fraud attempts, we have more than enough to charge him with multiple felonies." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders because the truth was right there on that video for everyone to see. Officer Martinez told me they would need me to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement, but for tonight I should rest, and they would post an officer outside my building just in case Jack tried to come back. After they left, I sat down on my couch and just let myself cry because the emotional roller coaster of the past several hours had been overwhelming, and I looked around at all my mother's things, and I felt her presence like she was watching over me, and I knew she would have been proud of how I had fought back against Jack. The next morning, Officer Martinez called and told me that Jack had been arrested at 6 a.m. at his apartment, and when officers searched his place, they found my phone along with several forged documents, including a fake psychiatric evaluation report with my name on it and a fraudulent power of attorney form that would have given Jack legal control over my assets. They also found evidence that Jack had been researching psychiatric hospitals and commitment procedures and had been planning this scheme for at least 3 months. Jack had initially tried to claim he locked me in for my own safety because I was suicidal, but when they showed him the security camera footage, his story fell apart completely, and he eventually admitted to everything, though he tried to justify it by saying he deserved the apartment more than I did. Officer Martinez said Jack was being charged with unlawful imprisonment, theft, attempted fraud, forgery, and several other crimes, and would likely face several years in prison. The trial happened about 6 months later, and it was difficult because I had to sit in that courtroom and face Jack and recount everything while he glared at me like I was the villain. His lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive and suggested I had orchestrated the whole thing to frame Jack, but the security camera footage and the documents and testimony from Mrs. Hall and the police made it impossible for anyone to believe his version. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts, and the judge sentenced Jack to 5 years in prison followed by probation, and he was ordered to pay restitution for the emotional distress and legal fees. As they led Jack away in handcuffs, he looked at me one last time, and I saw something that might have been regret, but either way, I felt nothing but relief that this chapter was finally closed. After the trial, I started volunteering with a legal aid organization that helps elderly people and vulnerable adults protect themselves from financial exploitation, because I realized what happened to me could happen to anyone. I also became an advocate for requiring security cameras in apartment buildings and for strengthening laws around guardianship so people like Jack can't manipulate the system. Mrs. Hall and I became very close friends, and we often joke about how that little red blinking light saved my life. I still live in my mother's apartment, and every day I'm grateful for the home she left me and for the strength she gave me through her warning letter, and I know she's watching over me and proud that I didn't let Jack win. Looking back on that terrible night when Jack locked me in my own home, I realize it was a turning point because it forced me to discover a strength I didn't know I had, and it taught me that even in your darkest moments when you feel completely helpless, there is always hope if you refuse to give up. The security camera footage became the miracle that saved me and proved that sometimes help comes from unexpected places, and justice does prevail. Jack thought he had planned the perfect crime, but he forgot that the truth has a way of coming to light, and karma catches up with people who hurt others for selfish gain. I'm no longer the quiet woman who keeps to herself because that experience changed me and made me realize that sometimes you have to speak up and fight for what's right, because if you don't stand up for yourself, then nobody else will. This is Diana Cooper, and this is my story of how my stepbrother tried to destroy my life on my birthday, but ended up destroying his own instead, and how a little red blinking light became the witness that brought a criminal to justice. If you're going through something similar, please don't stay silent because there is always hope and people who care. Thank you for listening, and remember to subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Stay strong and never let anyone make you feel crazy or helpless, because you are stronger than you think, and you deserve to be safe and respected in your own home. Justice may take time, but it always finds its way to the truth.